Welcome to Herbally Yours, an adventure into the world of natural medicine. Here is your host, Dr. Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse who will help you take the leap to ultimate wellness.
Greetings, and thank you for joining me, Ellen Kamhi, the natural nurse, for another edition of Herbally Yours, right here on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen on air or online at iHeartRadio, Odyssey, TuneIn app, smart speakers, or nccradio.org. And you could choose to download our award-winning WHPC app and hear all of our shows right here on 90.3 WHPC. Herbally Yours continually brings you the latest information about the many facets in the world of natural living. Today, we are so happy to bring on board our guest, Dr. Colby Kash. And he'll be talking about how to regain sovereignty over your body and your life. Dr. Kash is the author of The Autoimmune Plague, How to Regain Sovereignty Over Your Body and Life. And Dr. Kash is a doctor of chiropractics, and he has a master's in applied clinical nutrition at Northeast College of Health Sciences, which I believe was New York Chiropractic College. Is that possible? Where I was a professor for several years. And he also has a BS in applied physiology and kinesiology from the University of Florida College of Human and Health Performance. And he's been studying in many venues such as functional medicine, sports medicine, and we're so happy to bring him on board today as our guest. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Colby Kash.
It's great to be here, Ellen, and thank you for that wonderful introduction. And indeed, you are correct. New York Chiropractic College is rebranded as Northeast College of Health Sciences, and I did not know that you were a former professor there, so that's a very funny coincidence.
Right, and so I was in the, for that specific program, the Master's in Clinical Nutrition, and I taught herbal medicine, so hopefully, they're still teaching that there, because that was a great way to, integrate botanical medicine along with chiropractic knowledge and your nutritional knowledge. What made you choose to write a book on the autoimmune plague, which unfortunately is a plague at this point in time?
Yeah, it's a little bit of a play on words, because autoimmune disease is of course not contagious, but it is plaguing us. And you look now, there's up to 50 million Americans with at least one autoimmune disease. That's 1 in 5 women, and it just continues to skyrocket generation to generation. So there must be some underlying cause in our environment that's contributing to it. And
let me just jump in there. I agree, but so often in conventional medicine they say we've always had this. It's just that they're doing better tracking now.
It's a double whammy. In some regard, there's better tracking, and that may contribute a certain extent to the increase, but we're seeing orders of magnitude increases in certain diseases, and there's populations around the world that could serve as controls where we could track them just as well now, and yet you see complete absence in many of the inflammatory disorders that we have here that are continuing to grow. And once the Western diet and lifestyles imported, you start to see a lot of the issues we have here, which I'm looking forward to jumping deeper into. But real quick, just to give a background of my story, I've had digestive issues as far back as I could remember. And sort of the answer I got from conventional doctors, a litany of them that I went to, was, well, you're human, so of course you have gut issues. This is normal. And eventually it spiraled worse and worse until I was diagnosed with Crohn's disease, where your immune system attacks your digestive organs. And then I was diagnosed with another 2 autoimmune diseases, one an inflammatory arthritis and psoriasis as well. And as you alluded to in the intro, this was around the time I was studying physiology and biology, functional medicine, and I was able to to use a lot of the knowledge that I was learning and start applying it to my own situation.
Wow, that's really a great story because you're going to be able to help so many people. But it is unfortunate. So what kind of therapeutics were offered to you through a mainstream conventional medicine?
When you look at the holistic perspective on health, it includes both ancient wisdom, but also modern science. And I think the best prognosis for patients is really the combination of two, not to be scared away from one or the other. In the case of Crohn's disease, there's different lines of defense. They start with different oral anti-inflammatories, and then you work your way down to these what they call biologics that suppress the immune system. Some of them are antibodies that go against inflammatory mediators in the body. Unfortunately, one of the less severe medications or less powerful medications in my body actually had the opposite effect. It triggered the arthritis that I experienced, the psoriatic arthritis, inflammatory arthritis. I woke up one day with many of my joints swollen to golf balls, and unfortunately that didn't work for me. And then I went on to try some of the biologics, which I had some success with, but it was not enough to get rid of all the symptoms. And that's where I would tie in the nutritional and environmental component of a holistic treatment.
So that was your own personal path as well.
Yes.
So, that's really, very interesting and will inform your professional life for years to come. A good thing to talk about there, of course, which is not discussed at all, I would say, in conventional diagnosis or treatment of autoimmune disease. I never hear any discussion about diet, but yet you talk about what is the ideal diet, which may not be the same thing for everyone.
I agree totally. There's a certain level of what's called biochemical individuality, where different people produce different amounts of enzymes, and organs can be different lengths, and etc. Humans evolved all over the globe. And so we're from different regions and have different adaptations. And I always like to look through an evolutionary lens. And you could look at one hunter-gatherer tribe called the Katavans from Papua New Guinea, and they consume mostly fish and coconuts. And then you have the Inuit of the Arctic, and they consumed a majority of their calories from the saturated fat of seal or whale blubber. And then one other example is the Aboriginals of Australia that lived on land mammals and reptiles and insects. And all of these groups, when you track their health markers, they're all robust in the absence of the inflammatory issues that we have here in the West. And so they have a diverse diet, but the one commonality is its absence of the processed and packaged foods that many Americans are consuming the majority of their diets from today. And so although there's not an ideal one ideal diet, I think if people resemble their diet a little bit more like we were evolutionarily designed to, they can move their health in the right direction.
Okay, so what you're saying, Dr. Kash, is that there is a genetic component. It's really interesting when we look at like blood typings, that very often we relate to that in terms of sort of a familial lineage. And yet the common factor through your research that you're finding that's problematic is the ultra-processed food.
Yeah, so I mean, you touched on the genetic factor, which is interesting, and I did a lot of research and talked about genetics in the book, because your genes predispose you to certain diseases. But in the case of autoimmune diseases, the genes that predispose you in our ancestral environment were actually protective, because it's a code for a stronger immune response to microbes in the environment. However, you take away an environment that is teeming with a diverse amount of microbes, and you put yourself in the modern environment where it is a little bit of a paradox between, it's called the hygiene hypothesis, whereas the dirtier your upbringing when you're younger. If you're a farmer or you grew up with less hygienic environment, you're less likely to get autoimmune disease down the road. It almost serves as like an education for the plastic immune system when you're young. But if you grew up in more of a hygienic environment, absent of that, and you're loading up on many doses of antibiotics and you're killing that diversity in the gut, it actually increases your chances of obtaining not just autoimmune disease, but allergies and asthma down the road as well.
That is very interesting, Dr. Kash. So you're saying something that might be termed the helicopter mom, where they're like, they don't let their child touch anything that might have dirt on it and every second. And not only that, they're making them neurotic, which I think feeds into autoimmune developing disease as well. But you're saying the lack of interacting with just dirt in the environment actually can not be good for you.
Yep, that's what the evidence suggests. And dirt is one. People that have pets have a more diverse microbiome. It also goes into one interesting look is babies born via cesarean section have an increased chance of developing autoimmune disease, and they believe it's because when the baby goes through the vaginal canal, they're exposed to certain bacteria that help the learning immune system. Whereas if they're brought out through C-section, their microbiome resembles more the hospital bacteria. You don't quite recover from it. So it's an important aspect to consider if you have kids or you're planning on having kids, is exposing them to a safe but diverse environment, including the foods that they consume as well.
Yeah, so that's something that must have interested you. Were you able to use this information and help yourself in terms of dealing with some of these autoimmune issues?
Absolutely. So as I was sharing, is I like to look through an evolutionary lens, because humans developed for millions of years to a certain environment. Only relatively recently did we change that environment. You look, about 10,000 years ago, humans shifted from a hunter-gathering diet of meat, fish, fruits, vegetables, and some nuts and seeds over to agriculture, where they started consuming high amounts of grains. And this is the same point in time in the archaeological record that humans shrunk in stature. We began getting high amounts of cavities, bone lesions, etc. We were able to feed more mouths, but it was a less nutrient-dense diet. I try to resemble a diet that's consistent with evolution, because, there's many different popular diets out there, but the one thing that doesn't really have an agenda is evolution, because they don't have any books to sell, per se. So, first, and this is where it becomes individual, is everyone's immune system is slightly different. All humans look different on the outside, but our immune systems are much more diverse than some of the physical attributes that you see. And the majority of your immune system lies in the gut, where you're exposed to different particles from your environment through the consumption of food. And so a superfood for me might actually be toxic for you, Ellen, and vice versa. So that's where the elimination diet comes into the picture, to see what your body could handle versus someone else. And you got to be kind of strict and methodical with it, taking out food groups for weeks at a time to see how your immune system and the symptoms that you're experiencing react to it.
Well, I want to remind our listeners you're listening to Herbally Yours on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Listen live online at nccradio.org, iHeartRadio, or any podcast venue of your choice. For more information on today's guest or topic, you can email us at whpc@ncc.edu. And our guest today is Dr. Colby Kash, who is a chiropractor and also the author of The Autoimmune Plague, How to Regain Sovereignty Over Your Body and Life. And Dr. Colby Kash, what is the best, let's say, website, or where can people find you?
You could find The Autoimmune Plague on Amazon, or you could go to the autoimmuneplague.com.
Okay,
and you can download the first chapter.
Oh, excellent. So you actually have a website that people can find it at, autoimmuneplague.com. Okay.
The autoimmuneplague.com or autoimmuneplague.com. Both of them are good.
Oh, that's a good idea, because people are always making that kind of mistake. Now, when you're talking about food elimination in terms of trying to figure out what is linked to you. And you know what is just amazing? I started in this field in 1964. Yes, that's with a 6. And even then, the information that you're talking about was well documented. And yet today, conventional doctors, let's say rheumatologists and others involved in autoimmune illness, they're not discussing food. How is that possible?
Yeah, I think for a number of reasons. Well, you'll see it's slowly shifting. I think some of the younger practitioners are starting to include it more now that it's so. But it's kind of sad to see that you have a lot of people suffering and they're not given that option.
They're not only option; they're not even told to consider it. Why stop eating your junk food? Why stop eating a sandwich, wheat 15 times a day? I really think wheat is one of the main ones. With my own clients, which I saw for 27 years, I always would have people stop eat all wheat for a month before they came to see me. And I can't tell you how many people called and said, you know what? I don't have the problem anymore. I mean, and there is no negative side effect to try that.
Yeah, there's different schools of thought. And I think in many ways, when you go down the conventional route, you're very focused on how to solve the problem with the medication. And that's the way you're trained to diagnose and treat. And then more of the Eastern or holistic-y approach, you're more geared towards root cause. And that's the worldview. And that's the way your brain maps out how to treat the patient. And there should definitely be more of the middle grounds where you have more tools at your disposal for the best patient prognosis. But the first line of defense should be sort of these lifestyle and diet alterations, because inside of your cells have an innate intelligence. And of course you're going to get sick when you change the environment and you start putting things in your body that it wasn't adapted to ever have. And so I align with that thinking, and I agree with you.
Because sometimes something like that, there's no negative side effect to try it. Well, a lot of these pharmaceuticals, such as Humana, which is one of the drugs that are used, these drugs they're on all the time, Humira, et cetera, on commercials. You just have to watch the commercial, and they talk about, it possibly can kill you, but it might help. So it's just so much, it seems to make so much more sense to look at your book, The Autoimmune Plague, and address it naturally first. Then if you do need a pharmaceutical, they're there as a backup. But they're not an appropriate first line of intervention, in my opinion, because they have severe adverse effects. They could help, though, which is the good part, but so much better to try something that really has no horrible side effects. And either way, you're better off with less inflammation. Yeah.
I sort of see some politicians waking up, because it comes from lobbying in many ways. And you see more politicians waking up to, how do we make recommendations to the public? How do we get this information out there to the average Joe, so that they have the decision of which avenue they want to go down?
Okay, well, if you want to bring politics in, we could bring politics in, because I will say this about politics. It is not to the pharmaceutical industry's benefit to get the kind of information you're sharing. And they are some of the heaviest people who pay for the politicians to stay in power. So that's something just to consider.
Yeah, and from an insurance company perspective, you have to make a case of why it will save the insurance company more money to go down one route than the other. And you get into insurance reimbursement models. And I think down the road, if you could prove, there is proof, but if you could sort of galvanize more and more data points, you could get insurance companies on the side of how they could save money promoting one treatment way over another.
Well, maybe. I hope so. But I actually think that they're in bed with the pharmaceutical companies and often owned by the pharmaceutical companies. So the bottom line is very much linked to pharmaceutical sales. That's my opinion. That's not Dr. Colby Kash's opinion. So let me ask you about the microbiome, because that word is becoming something that even many mainstream people are recognizing. How does that have to do with our topic for today, the autoimmune plague?
So your body is made up of likely more bacteria cells than human cells. You're more bacteria than human, which is crazy when you think about it. But they're really part of you because they're producing a constant stream of chemical signals that interact with every cell receptor on every human cell in your body. And they're turning on different genes and switching them off. You have hundreds of thousands of switches on the barrier of your cells, and it's giving instructions. So if you have an overgrowth of quote unquote bad bacteria that's sending inflammatory signals, you're turning on genes for disease. If you have an inflamed gut, it's going to send signals that hit receptors on your skin, causing acne, rosacea, etc. It might cross the blood-brain barrier and contribute to anxiety, depression, and other neurological conditions. So the ecosystem of your gut plays an important role in the health of all your organs in your body. And there happens to be a lot that we could do to shift the health of the microbiome, and that's great, and that's something I'd like to share as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
So everyone's heard of probiotics, and they can oftentimes be very effective, but the greatest body of research supports fermented foods, which includes things like kimchi and sauerkraut, and even raw milk. And these foods contain not just probiotics, but they contain prebiotics, which act as food for the good bacteria, and then something called postbiotics, which is like an excretion from the bacteria. But in an ecosystem, one organism's poo is another one's food, and one postbiotic is called butyrate, and that serves as food for your gut lining. And so with someone with a broken down gut barrier, it could serve as a way to decrease inflammation and seal it back up. And we could also discuss leaky gut, which is where you're consuming a large amount of environmental, we could call them toxins. They're not always toxins, but they might be provocative for your immune system. And over time, it sort of breaks down the gut lining until the gap junctions that allow food particles to slip through into the bloodstream get bigger and bigger until food that wouldn't normally slip through into the bloodstream begins to slip through into the bloodstream. And this begins an inflammatory cascade, which is linked to many of the autoimmune diseases that plagues Americans in increasing amounts.
So true. When I used to speak about that leaky gut in front of physicians, which I lectured many times, they would say, oh, well, that's not a real thing. I said, okay, so why don't we just call it intestinal permeability? Is that a real thing? That they got. It was really funny.
It sounds like you were a true pioneer and probably knew about this stuff decades before many people look up to it.
Yeah, and it was all there. In fact, I wrote a book called Arthritis, The Alternative Medicine Definitive Guide. That includes all the theories that you're talking about, but it's great that you have your book, The Autoimmune Plague, How to Regain Sovereignty Over Your Body and Life. And along with that, you have a personal story to tell and how it helped you as well, which is so useful for people looking for that kind of information.
Yeah. No, I wrote it. It's written in such a way that it's like a user manual.
Perfect.
You pick it up, and there's one chapter that's deep in the science, and I say, listen, if you're not interested in the mechanisms, you could skip over this chapter. It might be boring for you, and then you can get into the stuff that's easier to digest. And then you could say, oh, I want to try this out and this, and you could tailor it to your own needs.
That's excellent. And also, you talk about what supplements might be good. You just shared with us something like foods. It's interesting with kimchi and sauerkraut that those kinds of fermented foods developed in completely different areas of the world, and all grandmothers love it. Whether you're an Asian grandmother or a European grandmother, they all love it. It's got to be good.
Yeah. Yeah, it sort of has stood the test of time. And many of the foods that were once part of ethnic, staples, we've lost in just recent generations, including organ meats, which, if you look at top carnivores in nature or hunter-gatherer tribes, this is the first part of the animal that is consumed. And when you break it down from a nutritional perspective, it's the most bioavailable, nutrient-dense food in nature, and it's important to also include organs in your diet as best as possible. It's a little bit harder to get today,
and especially if someone's a vegan. So we'll have to put that discussion off for another day. But our guest today, Dr. Colby Kash, author of The Autoimmune Plague, How to Regain Sovereignty Over Your Body and Life. Thank you so much, Dr. Kash.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me on.
And thank you, listeners, for tuning into Herbally Yours, produced in the studios of 90.3 WHPC, Nassau Community College, Garden City, New York. For further information, email us at whpc@ncc.edu. This is your host, Ellen Kamhi at naturalnurse.com, inviting you to join us next week for another edition of Herbally Yours. Until then, stay healthy.